Okay, so you put together quite the collection here, really a deep dive into Donald Trump's first term as president.
Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating period to revisit, full of moments that, well, let's just say sparked quite a few strong reactions. And yeah, some pretty sharp divides across the board.
Yeah, just skimming through the headlines and summaries, it's pretty clear we're looking at a time that really shook things up.
Mm.
So what we want to do today is kind of get to the heart of what went down. You flagged 9 specific events that really stand out, and our goal is to sort of unpack them in a way that helps make sense of all the uh, I think chaos was the word used in some of your
Okay.
sources. Yeah, without drowning in every little detail,
Exactly. It's about extracting those key insights from this mountain of information you've gathered.
right? Kind of like distilling it down to its purest form.
Yeah.
So these 9 events you've highlighted, they act as a sort of roadmap to understanding the major themes and turning points of that presidency.
Precisely. And I think it makes sense to start with the Muslim travel ban back in 2017. One of the administration's first big moves right out of the gate, restricting travel from 7 Muslim majority countries: Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen.
Right. And this immediately triggered a huge reaction, didn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
mass protests erupting at airports. It wasn't just a
Right.
policy announcement. It was like, well, the information you sent over talks about immediate and pretty significant public pushback. What aspects of that initial response really stood out to you?
I think it's the speed and intensity of it all. It wasn't just a few isolated protests, it was this widespread outpouring of concern and opposition. And it immediately raised all these questions about the legality of the ban and, potential impact on individuals and families. The sources you provided really zero in on that human element, stories of people being detained, families separated at airports. All of that fueled the outrage and eventually the legal challenges that followed.
Yeah, and those legal challenges were swift and persistent, weren't they?
Mm.
This wasn't a smooth implementation by any means. The initial ban faced a ton of pushback in the courts, leading to revisions and more revisions.
Yeah.
What does that back and forth tell us about this particular policy and the reaction to it?
It speaks to the tension between executive power and judicial oversight. I mean, the fact that the ban was challenged so quickly and blocked repeatedly, it suggests there were serious doubts about its constitutionality. And it also highlights the determination of various groups to fight back against what they saw as a fundamentally discriminatory policy.
Right. Okay, moving on to another defining moment from 2017 Charlottesville and the white supremacy controversy. This one even now feels incredibly impactful. Your notes describe the far-right rally, the counter-protests, and then that horrific incident with the car and the death of Heather Heyer. What, in your view, were the core elements that made this event so pivotal?
I think this event really laid bare the deep racial and ideological divides in American society. It was a tragic and stark illustration of that. And what really amplified the controversy was the president's response specifically, that very fine people on both sides comment. As your sources highlight, that statement was widely interpreted as a failure to unequivocally condemn white supremacism.
Yeah, and the fallout from that comment was intense.
Yeah.
It really seemed to pour fuel on an already raging fire and galvanized a lot of people who felt it legitimized, or at least normalized, extremist ideologies. Did your sources point to any lasting shifts in the national conversation after Charlottesville?
Absolutely. Charlottesville became a touchstone. It forced a renewed and often very difficult national conversation about race hate groups, the legacy of white supremacy in America, and the protests that erupted across the country. They weren't just about that specific event. They reflected a broader anxiety about the direction of the country and the administration's handling of these incredibly sensitive issues. It really raised fundamental questions about national identity and values.
Yeah. Okay, then. In 2018, we have the family separation at the border policy, the zero-tolerance approach to immigration, leading to that incredibly distressing situation. Can you remind us of the underlying logic or perhaps the illogic behind this specific policy?
Right. So the zero tolerance policy essentially meant that every adult caught crossing the border illegally was to be criminally prosecuted. And because you can't hold children in adult detention facilities, this blanket prosecution policy inherently led to the separation of parents and children. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't some unintended consequence. It was a direct result of how the policy was designed.
Yeah, and the images and reports that came out during that time were just heartbreaking. Children being held in cages. It's just difficult to reconcile that with any sense of basic human decency. What kind of long-term impact did your sources suggest this policy might have, both for the families involved and for America's image on the world stage?
The sources are very clear about the profound trauma inflicted on both the children and the parents who were separated. And the psychological scars of that experience are likely to be long-lasting. On a broader level, the policy triggered widespread international condemnation. It damaged America's reputation globally and raised serious concerns about its commitment to human rights.
All right, let's move on to the government shutdown over the border wall in late 2018 and early 2019. This seems like a classic example of political gridlock having very real consequences for everyday people.
Mhm.
What was the core issue that led to that record-breaking shutdown?
The central issue was funding for the border wall. The president demanded $5.7 billion from Congress to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. This was a key campaign promise, and he was absolutely insistent on securing the money. But Congress, particularly the House after the midterms, was unwilling to approve that level of funding, and that's what created the impasse.
And this wasn't just a behind-closed-doors political squabble. Your notes highlight that it lasted a whopping 35 days, making it the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. What were some of the most significant real-world consequences of that prolonged period of inaction?
The impact was widespread and really painful. You had 800,000 federal employees either furloughed or forced to work without pay for over a month, causing tremendous financial hardship. And beyond that, essential government services were disrupted, everything from airport security to national parks operations. And then there was the broader negative effect on the economy. It was a stark reminder of just how damaging political gridlock can be.
Okay, then we move into 2019 and 2020 with the Ukraine scandal and the first impeachment. This was a complex series of events. Can you break it down for us? What were the central accusations that led to the impeachment proceedings?
At the heart of it all was the allegation that President Trump had pressured the Ukrainian government, specifically President Zelensky, to investigate Hunter Biden, the son of then presidential candidate Joe Biden. And the accusation was that this pressure was directly linked to the withholding of crucial military aid that Ukraine desperately needed to defend itself against Russian aggression. So essentially a quid pro quo, a favor for a favor.
And the House of Representatives ultimately voted to impeach him on that basis. What were the specific charges brought against him?
The House approved 2 articles of impeachment abuse of power for using his office for personal political gain and obstruction of Congress for resisting the House's attempts to investigate the matter. But as your sources point out, he was later acquitted by the Senate.
Right. Your notes also suggest that this whole process further deepened the partisan divide in Washington. It seems like these kinds of high-stakes political battles often have that effect, kind of exacerbating existing fault lines.
Absolutely. Impeachments are inherently divisive, and this one took place in an already incredibly polarized political climate. It just solidified the positions of both sides and likely made it even harder to find common ground on other issues.
Okay. Turning to 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic became a global crisis, and your sources seem to take a pretty critical view of the administration's response in the U.S. What were some of the key areas where the handling of the pandemic drew the most criticism?
Well, several things emerge. One is the initial downplaying of the virus and a reluctance to acknowledge the scale of the threat. Then there was the promotion of unproven or even harmful treatments like hydroxychloroquine and that whole injecting disinfectant idea, which went against the advice of medical and scientific experts. And then there's the overall assessment that the U.S. response was weaker than in many other developed nations, leading to a higher death toll.
Yeah, the number of deaths in the U.S. during that time is staggering. Your sources mentioned over 400,000 under his presidency. That's just a devastating figure. What underlying factors, based on the information you've reviewed, do you think contributed to that outcome?
The lack of a unified science-based national strategy seems to be a major factor highlighted in the sources. Issues with testing capacity, inconsistent public health messaging, and a reluctance at the highest levels to fully embrace things like mask wearing and social distancing likely all played a role in the rapid spread of the virus and the resulting death toll.
Also in 2020, the nation witnessed the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd. Your sources describe a period of intense social unrest and a pretty significant federal response. Can you outline some of the key moments and the nature of the government's reaction as presented in your material?
The protests, which were largely peaceful demonstrations against racial injustice and police brutality, were sometimes met with a very strong-handed federal response. Your notes point to President Trump's rhetoric labeling some protesters as terrorists and the deployment of federal law enforcement to several cities, often against the wishes of local authorities.
One incident that really stands out is that event in Washington, D.C., where peaceful protesters were tear-gassed in Lafayette Square, seemingly to clear a path for a photo op. What did your sources suggest was the significance of that moment?
That event became a symbol of the tension and distrust between the protesters and the federal government. It raised serious questions about the use of force against peaceful demonstrators and the administration's priorities. That image of citizens being forcibly dispersed for a photo op, it really resonated and further inflamed public debate.
Okay, then we come to the aftermath of the 2020 election lies and the second impeachment. This period was marked by a sustained effort to challenge the results. What were the main narratives being pushed according to your sources?
After losing to Joe Biden, President Trump repeatedly and falsely claimed that the election was stolen because of widespread voter fraud. Your sources detail numerous instances of these claims, often without any credible evidence. And they highlight the pressure placed on state and local election officials, especially in Georgia, to overturn the results or to find more votes.
And these claims really gained traction with a sizable portion of the population, didn't they? Your notes talk about the spread of conspiracy theories. This wasn't just a legal challenge, it became a broader narrative, questioning the very legitimacy of the democratic process.
Exactly. The constant repetition and amplification of these baseless claims chipped away at public trust in democratic institutions and created deeper divisions within the electorate. As your sources emphasize, this campaign of misinformation is widely seen as a direct precursor to the events of January 6th.
Which brings us to the final event in your compilation, the January 6th Capitol insurrection. This was without a doubt a watershed moment. Can you walk us through the sequence of events as presented in your sources and the role, if any, attributed to President Trump?
Sure. So the sources describe a day where a large group of Trump supporters gathered in Washington, D.C. Following a rally where he repeated his claims of a stolen election and urged them to fight like hell, a significant number of these individuals marched to the U.S. Capitol and forcibly breached the building. This all happened while Congress was in the process of certifying the election results. The goal was to disrupt that certification and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Your notes highlight the president's speech right before the attack and his delayed response in calling for the rioters to stand down.
Right, and there's a human cost as well. Your notes mention 5 deaths and the sheer disruption to the functioning of government with members of Congress having to be evacuated. What was the immediate reaction and the broader significance of this event, according to your sources?
The immediate aftermath was shock and condemnation, both in the U.S. and internationally. The attack on the Capitol was widely seen as an assault on American democracy itself. The House of Representatives impeached President Trump for a second time, this time, charging him with inciting the insurrection. And social media platforms, especially Twitter, took action to suspend his accounts, citing concerns about further incitement of violence. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions and the potential consequences of unchecked political rhetoric.
Yeah, your compilation ends with a pretty stark assessment, a chaos level of 10 out of 10 for this period, emphasizing the deep and lasting political and social divisions that these events contributed to. It's a pretty powerful way to sum it all up.
It is, and it reflects the cumulative impact of everything we've discussed.
Yeah.
The narrative that runs through your sources consistently points to a presidency defined by turbulence, controversy, and a deepening of existing societal divides.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, looking at these 9 pivotal moments from Donald Trump's first term. And the picture that emerges is certainly one of upheaval and intense division.
Absolutely. The materials you've gathered paint a very clear picture of a presidency that was anything but conventional. And the actions and policies of that time generate a lot of controversy and had a lasting impact on American politics.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought. Given these 9 distinct events we've explored, from the travel ban to the January 6th insurrection, what single factor do you believe contributed most significantly to the level of chaos described in these sources? And what does your answer suggest about the nature of political leadership and its impact on the direction of a nation? It's worth thinking about how these events might be interconnected and what broader forces might have been at play. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.